YouTube Live together? Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Yay. Uh, right now, I'd like to say hello and welcome you to an inside look at the Normal Public Library. An Inside Look is a collaboration between the Normal Public Library and Heartland Theatre Company that gives us a behind-the-scenes view of current productions at Heartland Theatre. But right now, Heartland Theatre audiences can't go to the theater for live events, so Heartland has been offering radio plays. Heartland produced The War of the Worlds on October 30th and is currently rehearsing The Gift of the Magi, a holiday play, which will air on Friday, December 11th at 8 p.m. on WGLT, and that's why tonight's program is called An Inside Look Radio Plays. Likewise, we usually meet for this program in the library cafe, but we aren't meeting in person for programming at the library anymore either, so here we are on YouTube. I'm Kathleen Burke. I work here at the library and serve on the board of Heartland Theatre. I'm here with John Fisher, Director of Adult Services for the library, who has also acted on Heartland's stage. John is handling our Zoom room of 6 theater artists, as well as our live broadcast on YouTube, and he will be monitoring your comments and questions, which you can feel free to type in at any time you have them in the comments section right under the YouTube video. And later on, John will relay those to us at the appropriate time. For now, I'd like to briefly introduce our 6 panelists and then ask them some questions of my own before we gather again at the end for questions from the audience. Reese Lovell is the artistic director of our theater company and also directed and acted in War of the Worlds. His sound designer was Aaron Palucci, who has his own sound studio here and teaches at Illinois State University. Sandra Zielinski is directing Gift of Life coming up on December 11th. Her sound designer is Tony Reimer. And we'd have 2 very special guests tonight. Bob Cooner is here as playwright. He adapted O. Henry's short story, The Gift of the Magi, into the radio play that you'll hear in December. And Bethany Hart is here as dialect coach for Gift of the Magi, and she'll tell us a bit about the dialects we'll be hearing on the radio soon. Right now, let's start with Reese. Reese, my first question for you is, what made you think of doing this particular play at this time?
Well, I'd been kicking the idea around in my head for several years. In fact, a few years back, we did a cutting from it in person for an event at the McLean County Arts Center. But what I had always envisioned pre-pandemic was a live production on Heartland Theater's stage of the full Orson Welles radio play, complete with the live Foley sound effects, the works. But earlier this year, when it became clear to me that theaters across the country would be shut down for quite some time, I revisited this idea of producing The War of the Worlds, but instead of doing it before a live theater audience, doing it as Orson Welles did on radio. Even though I had never read the H.G. Wells novel, I knew the general story behind it, made famous, of course, through the 1938 Orson Welles Mercury Theater on the Air broadcast. So when the idea of Heartland doing it started to gain some traction. And after I knew that WGLT was interested in partnering with us on the project, I sat down and I listened to the original recording in its entirety.
Yay. What was it like to follow in Orson Welles' footsteps as director and as actor?
Well, it's a little daunting, a lot of people have come before me, though. This is a broadcast that has been reproduced many, many times. It's been adapted into a movie. First, it came out in the 50s with, I think, Gene Tunney, I think. And then Steven Spielberg brought it back in the early 2000s. His adaptation, which was a bit of a twist on the original H.G. Wells novel. But I should probably also say that, Orson Welles changed the setting. Rather than London, it was transplanted to Grover's Mill, New Jersey.
Right, and that was a big part of some of the disruption for the original radio audiences at the time. Some of them listening you could hear it across the country.
Yeah.
But some people listening, they were in New Jersey, or New Jersey was right across the way. We have both movie versions at the library, as well as a fabulous book called Broadcast Hysteria, Orson Welles' War of the Worlds and the Art of Fake News. Because Mercury Theatre on the Air, which Orson Welles' company was, also included actors who read the news on the radio. I wasn't even aware of that till I read that book that we have at the library. Reese, I wanted to ask you, what safety protocols did you use to cast and rehearse the play, since we can't get together?
Yeah, the original broadcast was a much smaller cast than what we ended up with. Most of the actors, except for Orson Welles, played more than one role. I also saw a comment came in. I want to correct myself. It wasn't Gene Tunney. It was Gene Barry in the 1950s version. Thank you, Bob Cooner. So I was overwhelmed by the response that we got, the auditions. All of the auditions, all of the rehearsals were done remotely. So actors submitted audition tapes to me in advance. I listened to them, and then I cast based on that. I did have one night of callbacks where I invited actors to come into a Zoom room, sort of like now, so that I could hear actors actually reading opposite one another. But I had over 40 people, maybe 45 people who auditioned. There are a total of, I think, 17 or 18 roles in the play, and I was able to cast a different actor in each of them. So that was great.
That's terrific. I want to hear from Aaron Palucci, your sound designer, on Aaron, what about your own research as sound designer? Were you also able to listen to a recording of the original broadcast?
Yeah, certainly. The first thing I did was just go to YouTube, and I was able to listen to the entire recording. So I guess that's the start of my research for this project. And the first thing I noticed was it was hard to get to the content of the show through the distortion of time. As an audio engineer, I was listening to this like highly crackly, distorted, and fuzzy recording. So sort of like the archived remains of that original broadcast gets to us from like this very old-fashioned recording and old technology. And I realized that it was distancing me from the content inside the show. I think what made the show really tick was the sense that the events were unfolding as the audience is listening to it. And when you hear an old recording of it, even though it's very vintagey, 1930s in terms of the sound, it also makes it feel like we're listening to a recording of a historical event in the past, and therefore kind of just the very beginning of my research took me out of the sense that it was happening in the now. So one of the things that I realized right then was that I was philosophically wondering about these issues. I had to talk to Reese about it and figure out these kinds of questions like, should we make our version sound lo-fi and feel like it's entirely coming from this lens of past technology and past audio fidelity? Should we make it feel like the audience is hearing it as events unfold? If we do that, then we're sort of in this dichotomy between a contemporary production happening today versus trying to get everyone to pretend they live in the 30s and are seeing this event unfold in the 30s versus hearing the historical version of it as if it's just a recording that happened 80 years ago. I was asking Reese questions like, what time period are we in? How are we going to pull this off to connect to a contemporary audience? And we sort of decided to come up with sort of a hybrid style that could you hear sounds that kind of make sense in the 30s, but I was trying to pick sounds that weren't so dated that you could only hear them in the 30s. I wanted to find a police siren that made sense in the 30s, and in the 2020s, I wanted to find artillery and tank sounds that kind of spanned this universal sense of time. I wanted panicked crowds that could make sense seeing these fantastic events unfold in the 30s and in the 2020s. So I tried really hard to steer, based on what I was thinking about, into something that was sort of timeless. Didn't really matter what decade you listened to it in. It kind of unfolded as if it was happening then in real time. But then we also didn't want to lose the period, the 1930s. So what we also did do is slightly take, we had higher fidelity contemporary voice recordings. We had music that was recorded with modern recording techniques, but we wanted to make it sound a little bit like it was coming through from the past on older mics and older technology, but not to the point where it felt like it was just a really, really old, broken recording that felt like a yellowed, faded photograph, for instance.
Well, as someone who heard it, I think you did that really, really well. It was in this sort of suspended area of, am I now, or am I listening something to the past? Mm-hmm. What about your particular music choices? I remember that historically they were using music to, like, we're going back to a particular ballroom. Yeah. What were you doing?
Well, that was really interesting because the choices were somewhat dictated by the script. The script would say things like, and now we're gonna listen to Raymond McKellow and we're and his orchestra and their version of the La Comparsita, yeah, Comparsita and Stardust, and Raymond McKellow was an actual conductor, band leader, and had his orchestra. But then they also refer to things like the go to the Hotel Martinet and the Bobby Millette and his orchestra, which was totally fictitious. So they're referring to like real people and fictitious people and music that didn't exist and music that did exist. So a lot of it was sort of dictated by the script, and I had to find particular titles that made sense. But if you actually, like, for instance, the theme song for the Columbia broadcast, the Mercury Theater, is Tchaikovsky. It's a piano. It's It's the Concerto Number 1 in B flat minor, right? And if you go to the original recording that they actually used in the Mercury Theater, there's vintage recordings of those broadcasts, and it's got a very particular, instantly recognizable sound. But it's such a damaged old recording that if you used it, then we instantly go back to the sort of this yellowed, faded photograph analogy. So I had to find a contemporary arrangement of that piece that sounded like the original arrangement, that wasn't an old recording, and then lo-fi it back to the fact that it sounded older and more dated. So that's kind of an example of trying to flirt with this, the remnants of what we actually had from the 30s. The bits and pieces of recordings weren't really usable. They were just frameworks or references that then we had to mimic with modern recordings and then make it sound old fashioned again.
That's That's fascinating.
Yeah, it was really interesting. So I spent a lot of time just trying to figure out what references were actually real and to try to get to those original recordings to mimic them somehow, and which ones were fake, that I had to sort of like create the closest analogy by, making the best music choice possible.
When you taped the actors' voices as part of this, they're speaking right into microphones. So how did you deal with the COVID safety protocols to do that?
Well, luckily Reese had already established the policies, but I wrote it down so I'd be able to sort of remember all of the specific things we did. But one of the things we did was we recorded in a really big open room that had a lot of space, and obviously with COVID you need social distancing, so the more physical space you have, the more you can leverage that. And this room had really heavy duty, high flow air handling, so it was blowing a ton of air through the space, and that circulation is really important. And it had a stage area, and we had 2 mics, and we set them up 25 feet apart from each other. So anytime we had 2 actors on stage that needed to respond back and forth to each other as it was being recorded, any kind of conversational dialogue, there was huge separation between the 2 actors. I was 30 feet away off to the side, so I brought a lot of cabling just so that we could stretch it out. Everyone prior to the recording event had to get tested. Everyone walking into the space had to have their temperature taken. Everyone was wearing masks if they weren't actually speaking into a microphone at the time. Reese did some really organized scheduling to make sure that the fewest amount of people were actually in the room at any given time, so that we never had like a crowd of people waiting to be next. So there was a lot of sort of spacing and scheduling. Each mic got wiped down in between each take. So whenever someone was done, Reese would go up and he'd have a sanitizing wipe and wipe down each microphone. So there was a lot going on. The really interesting thing was the room was so big and so reflective and so noisy that I didn't tell Reese this, but I was panicked during the recording, because I was like, I'm pretty sure that the amount of reverb and reflection and background noise is going to be so dominant that stamp of that room will be permanently imbued in all the voice recordings. But I was able to kind of go in after the fact and noise reduce and de-reverb the recordings and get them back to the point where it sounded kind of close to like a controlled studio recording. So I was really pleased with what modern digital processing can do for me. So I didn't want to, like, it was too late once we got in there and I was listening. I didn't want to put us in a situation where I was like, this isn't going to work, Reese. So I just decided to just shut up and try to make it happen. And it worked out after the fact. So I'm glad that I didn't say anything. So.
Well, that's good to know. And I'm sure Tony Reimer and Sandra Zielinski are listening closely. Based on your experience, some things to expect. I'd like to shift to Gift of the Magi now and ask some questions for Bob Kuhner, who wrote the script. Bob, what led you to create a play adaptation of this story in the first place?
Well, as you might know, your listeners don't know, I was a high school English teacher, and for years I had been teaching the Gift of the Magi in 9th grade English, and it was certainly a story that I was familiar with already, something that I really enjoyed teaching. The theater, I work with a theater here in California where I live, and they had for years been looking for different kinds of holiday plays to present. And at one point, the guy who ran the theater at that time said, do you have a holiday play? And I said, well, no, but I bet I can write one. And I wrote one, not The Gift of the Magi, but something else entirely. And he really enjoyed it, and we ended up doing that play. But right after that, I thought, well, what else could I do? And I thought of The Gift of the Magi because, like I said, it was something I'd been teaching for a long time. And I thought that it would make a nice play. And so when I when I wrote it as an adaptation, I wrote it as a play. And that was about, I looked today just to see exactly how long ago that was. It was in 2013. So this has been brewing around for a long time. We did several readings over the next few years of this play at the theater where I do my work. But then when the pandemic hit, it occurred to me that other theaters might be looking for ways to present holiday programming that wouldn't be on stage. And so for the theater, Woodland Opera House is where I do my work. I wrote them an adaptation of A Christmas Carol. And I thought, well, I've got this Gift of the Magi play. Maybe I can do a radio adaptation of that as well. And so I did. I worked on that, and we did a reading or two of the radio version as well. And that's how that came to be.
That's terrific. What in your first version of Gift of the Magi, did you have you have additional characters? The original story is just a young married couple. Tell us a little bit about the extra characters, who they are and why they're there.
Right. Well, if you're going to write, an hour and a half, a 2-hour play, the story is a very simple little story, but I thought it needed other characters. One of the things that I decided right away was to move the action forward of the play. It was published originally in 1905, and I moved it about a decade later. 1917 actually is when my adaptation is set, and that's right at the beginning of the United States entry into World War I. And so that sort of informed some of my choices in terms of things that would have been going on at that time. And so, I decided to add quite a few characters and sort of change the main characters a little bit to kind of adapt to a more complex situation. So the main character is Della, and I decided to make her a first-generation American. Her parents were German immigrants. And so now she is a first-generation American living in German American living in a country that's now at war with Germany. She came from an immigrant family, and she has fallen in love and married James Dillingham Young, who I decided was from an upper crust New York family. And so we have this kind of cross class thing going on with the two of them. And that allowed me to do a lot of thinking about the kinds of lives they would lead. So I decided that James has decided that he's going to be someone who makes his own way in the world. He's going to not want help from his upper crust family, and is going to be a young, determined young man who's going to make his way on his own. And so he's very determined to do that, and that creates some conflict with him and his mother. So his mother is a character that I invented to add to the story. She's this upper crust New York matron who wants her son to have the life that she expected him to have, instead of this kind of more struggling life that he has made for himself and his young wife. I gave Della a father, Mr. Kraus, her German immigrant father, who has been having some health issues. And so she has felt a lot of responsibility in terms of trying to take care of her father and help him. It's a play about buying things. So I made a character of Mr. Kabrinsky, a pawn shop owner in Lower Manhattan, and he becomes kind of a major character actually in my adaptation, where they both get involved with Mr. Kabrinsky and his pawn shop. It's a struggling young family. So I created a character of a landlady that's expecting them to pay rent that they haven't paid. And her name is Mrs. Mullins, and she is an Irish American, but she has very strong opinions about patriotism, and the fact that Della is a young German American is not something that Mrs. Mullins appreciates very well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, This has really whetted my appetite to hear the play on December 11th at 8 o'clock on WGLT. Thank you so much, Bob. We might come back to you with some other questions later, but I want to hear from Sandra Zielinski, who's directing it. I'm going to back up for a minute and ask you, Sandra, about the difference between directing for the stage and directing for the radio. Bob was talking about he had a stage play and then he adapted it for the radio. What's this like for you, Sandy? Sandra, you'll want to unmute yourself. Sandra, we can't hear you. You need to unmute yourself. All right, she can't do it right now, so maybe we can.
There we go. I'm sorry.
No problem.
I couldn't find my mouse. At any rate,
the back's there, right? So to back up, what's it like to direct for radio instead of the stage?
Absolutely. Well, what I found was the preparation was much the same, because for both the stage and the radio, you still have to do research. And I have a production book that I divided according to characters, who's in what scene, and how we're going to rehearse. So that's the same as if I were working with this script on stage. The difference comes in the fact that when you are directing for the stage, you can stop everything, you can go up to the actor, and you and the actor can have this quiet conversation about what is going on, where are you, the kinds of questions that you only talk to perhaps one actor about. Well, you don't have that kind of going away into a corner and talking to an actor. So if you do give notes, it's not, everybody will hear it unless they're muted, all right, unless they're taken off. But that's a lot of time that might be wasted going in and out of scenes, backtracking, and so everybody hears the comments. And we also use the chat for comments after the actor is finished with their scene. But I found that you have to be much more succinct. You have to get to the point quicker, because you don't have the luxury of time of re-explaining, re-examining, because you're on a schedule that you yourself have put into place. So you're not going to make actors wait in the wait room for 15 minutes while you continue working with an actor. So I think you have to be much more, like, as I said, concise. You have to get to the point. You still can ask questions. It's still the same process, but you're not next to the actor. But a lot of the preparation was much the same.
That's really fascinating, and I wonder too. I wonder if it will change your directing any in the future. That succinctness, that efficiency sounds like good things that teachers are probably also learning it by teaching online.
Yeah, I think it will, Kathleen. I think it has made me more aware of time and timing, still using the Socratic method of asking questions, but getting to what is necessary and not the other things that will grow in a process. So I'm hoping that'll carry over with me.
Now, we heard from Bob about the extra characters in Gift of the Magi. What differences are you noticing between the story and the play that is making it more theatrical in the original story?
It is. Bob, you did a marvelous job. I love the dialogue. I love what's uncovered. In the original O. Henry script, it is narrated by a third person. looking at these two individuals who are going through, at that time, going through a really rough patch, but they love each other. And O. Henry focuses on immediately on the hair and the watch fob. That's where the story lies. All right. So the gift giving, it goes right there. You hear in O. Henry, you hear one conversation with James and Della in the story. You hear that. You also hear, interestingly enough, is Mrs. Sofrani when she speaks to Della. But that's it. That's all. So what Bob did was, and he mentioned it, he puts James's boss in there, Della's father, James's mother, a landlady, a sergeant, a sales lady, a pawn shop owner. And what that does for me is it raises the stakes for these characters. We see a broader world that he is picturing for us and the struggles that they have in getting to the point of selling the hair, to buy the combs, of selling the watch, to buy the combs, and for her hair to get the fob. So it's just marvelous how these characters talk back and forth. And, it's also true in directing. It's about relationships. For me, it's about relationships. It's how, the father relates to the daughter, the father. So in rehearsal, we worked on relationships because to me, that's the key. All right. And so in a radio drama, we can't look, at the person speaking and get that information from their face, from their gestures. It has to come through the voice. So the relationship becomes almost twice as important. So that's, I just thought that he did a marvelous job with the dialogue. And these people you just love.
That's wonderful to hear. And hearing that it's set in 1917 is an interesting irony too. That's the very beginning of what will become the flu pandemic of 1918, and here we are again, and dealing with different immigrants in the country, and here we are with those conflicts. So it's fascinating. I'm very eager to hear this. I want to shift to Bethany Hart now, dialect coach for Gift of the Magi. We heard from Bob, the countries of origin of some of the characters. So I want to ask you, what dialects will we hear, and how many? I know someone in our listening audience wants to know, how many different dialects will we be hearing when we listen to Gift of the Magi?
Yeah, the answer is a lot. Bob has given us the gift of this really wide-reaching story. It's a very diverse group of people, and they all have unique perspectives and unique backgrounds, and as a result, they have unique voices. And so the Gift of the Magi is really indicative of that American melting pot that we always talk about. And especially so, this is really magnified in New York and Manhattan, and even more in 1917, like we said, on the brink of World War I and the 1918 flu. So it's a really intense look at a lot of different people and a lot of different cultures and how they blend together. And so that's the first challenge, that there's a lot of voices happening, and as an actor, it's hard to listen and stay on dialect. And another challenge is that we don't have historical voice samples. The first thing I usually do as a dialect coach is look for those audio samples, most of the time of an authentic person being interviewed that he doesn't know that they're being studied for their voice, and I love to give those to actors, and we just don't have that with this production. So that was a really unique challenge. So our main characters, as we talked about, Della and James, were both born in New York, and they both have parents in the script. And you would think that those four voices would sound the same, but we're leaning into the theatrical tradition and really emphasizing the differences between these people, because Della is a first generation German immigrant, and so she knows English from birth, so she has a little bit of a lighter German accent, whereas her father, Mr. Kraus, was born in Germany, so he's got a little bit of a thicker German dialect going on. And in addition, I should mention that our understudies are even approaching these roles differently. Jessie is our main actor, and she is approaching a much thicker version of German. She's more authentic, and she doesn't need to bend to this new American culture, whereas Vicky, who's our understudy, is a lot more studied, and she wants to sound more like James. So that's reflected in our different sets of characters as well. So you'll hear the German, you'll hear a little bit of New York, you'll hear our surrounding characters. We've mentioned Jewish, we've mentioned Romanian, we've mentioned Irish landlady. And so all of those sounds are going to blend together and hopefully create the soundscape that you'll hear. So we're not only dealing with dialect in the show, we're dealing really specifically with idiolects and the difference, the unique individual difference between separate people. So it's really a fun challenge.
That's wonderful. How do you do it remotely? What's your take on not being able to work one-on-one live with actors?
It's different. It's very different, and it's a whole different set of skills and tools. I live in Chicago, and so it's a gift for me because it wouldn't be feasible for me to assist as much as I have been on this project. Between Chicago and Bloomington Normal, I don't have to commute, and so it's a lot easier for me to say yes to a project like this. I primarily work in voiceover up here, so I wouldn't be able to commute back and forth, but it is a new host of issues between you think you have good Wi-Fi and then you find out you don't have good Wi-Fi or a good microphone or a camera or whatever it is. And I have a personal issue in that my favorite thing is people's voices, but my second favorite thing is meeting their dogs. So I'd rather spend time in rehearsal meeting people's pets. So we have all sorts of distractions at home, our kids and all sorts of things in our house that can get in the way. But it's hard because normally the things that I would look at as a coach are maybe things like what people are wearing. Are you wearing heels? Are you wearing corsets? Or set considerations? Where are the flats located? Even the set materials that might soak up your voice or reverberate it. But all of those are eliminated when we have a radio show. And so we can be very intimate in our work and really focus in on the voice being in the body and being authentic to a person. And so I'm really excited for these actors to finally get their day in person and see what happens to their performances, because rehearsing on Zoom is fine and dandy, but actually recording, I think you're going to hear a lot of nuance that we wouldn't be able to hear thus far up until now in our Zoom rehearsals.
Well, Bethany, thank you so much. It sounds like the way you're working with the actors is just like the way Sandra's working on relationships in the way she directs. So that's very exciting. I'd like to hear from Tony Reimer now, who's the sound designer for Gift of the Magi. Now that you've listened to Aaron talk about taping in a large room, I'm interested in how your methods will be similar or different to the actual taping and your protocols. But I'd also like to hear, as we did before, about your preparation. So any way you want to let us know about your preparation as sound designer, or how you will actually go about doing the taping, which I think is yet to come.
Right. So I'm hoping to get a recording of this so I can just take everything that Reese and Aaron have already talked about. But so I think, as far as recording, the room that we're recording in, I've been in once, I think. And so we'll have to play that by ear, but it sounds, based on what I heard in War of the Worlds, I had no, I'm not that worried about capturing the audio. I think, in this particular script, that's a little bit more dialogue driven, I think that's going to present some some different kinds of challenges, but I think that it will be just fine. I'm not going to but as far as approaching this particular script, this story is it's a special one for me. It was my father's favorite Christmas story. He used to perform. So he and my mother would travel around. My mom played the piano, was trained as a classical pianist, and my father played the violin, not professionally. But they would travel around, and he had this version of the story that he would play at the same time that, so he'd tell part of the story, and then he'd play a verse of We Three Kings on the violin. And my mom would kind of subtly underscore while he was reading this adaptation of the O. Henry story. So it's a special story for me in that respect. I also did an adaptation of this way back in the mid-90s as a sound designer it was like a piece of a collection of holiday stories for a regional theater out in Massachusetts, and they in that case it was the very first time I edited dialogue on digitally. I had recorded this woman. It was a 6-minute monologue that took place in the middle of this play to allow for this humongous set change. But in any case, so we recorded this with the actress, and she was wonderful, but she was not. I had over 45 minutes worth of takes, and I had to cut all that down to 6 minutes. Okay, on tape, that would take a long time. That would take a very long time. And so I had allowed myself, I budgeted 10 hours to get this one thing done. And I had decided way in advance, so I'm going to try and edit this digitally. And I was able to complete the digital edit in an hour. So I had 9 hours off. It was amazing. But that's the ratio when when you move from the analog to the digital world. It's kind of crazy when you can see the words. All of a sudden, the editing just flies by. So in any case, I have a lot of close connections with this particular story, and I was thrilled to have the opportunity to work on this.
I loved learning the personal story, that it was your dad's favorite holiday story, and your musical parents. The question I have is, are you creating some music for this show?
Yeah, that's the goal. I just started playing around with some ideas today. As we're still, I guess we're less than 2 weeks. I really need to get going on this, but the plan is to create some music for it. Again, Bob's script is amazing in terms of storytelling without the need to tell the story with audio, which is having done a few radio play podcast things recently. It's very very nice to have such great world building already in the script and not having to inject that or layer it on top of the play. And so with respect to music, Bob's got a lot of contemporary references to tunes from the era. And in 1917, we're a little before the propagation of recorded music in any meaningful way. I mean, it's there, but so consequently, So consequently, having those references already in the script and they're already in the text of the play, Yankee Doodle is the one that's popping in my head. O Tannenbaum. These things are really built into the text already, and for me to be able to rip those melodies out and treat them in a way that is reflective of the particular moment in the script it's a lot of fun, and I feel like I'm coloring my numbers. I mean, the way it's been set up, it's really, really well done. So
That's great to hear, and I love how you and Aaron Palucci with War of the Worlds are finding your music right there in the script. It's there for you. Thank you all for answering my questions. I'd like to turn to John Fisher there at YouTube and find out if any of our listeners tonight have comments or questions that he would like to relay to us now. For any of you to answer, and it could be John has some questions of his own. I have a few extra questions, and our wonderful theater artists tonight might have some questions for each other. But John Fisher, anything from you?
Thank you, Kathleen. Thanks to all of our speakers tonight as well. It's really nice to just hear all about the preparations for these productions. You know, the first one that's here, there's really only a handful. Some of them have been answered already. They sort of popped in as the answer was coming, so I likely won't repeat those. This one just came in. How long is the Gift of the Magi radio play? And you'll need to unmute, Sandy, if that's you. You got it.
I think what we're counting on now is about a 90-minute show. We're not going to put it in parts, which means, for example, on the 11th we play Act 1, on the 12th we play Act 2. It will all be together, and I think with the sound, that's about where it will come in, is about 90 minutes.
Wonderful, thank you. Reese, I'm assuming Heartland Theatre will deliver 5-star water to the listeners out there? Maybe
yeah,
not.
We're piping it directly in. It doesn't matter where you are. You can get you can be hydrated with our 5-star bottled water, piped in from the mountain springs of East Peoria, Illinois.
This question, thank you, Reese. This question comes in from YouTube. Bethany, how do you approach dialogue so that listeners can still understand them on the radio?
Oh, that's a great question. One of my biggest jobs is being the advocate for the audience and the ears for the audience as we go along. And so what I'm always asking myself is if someone is authentic, if the voice is in their body and they could just talk to me without lines in the dialect and be understood, and if they're consistent. Even a casual listener notices if someone isn't consistent, if they're following a specific rule of speech and all of a sudden they do something a little bit different. All of a sudden you're like, oh, something's happening with that, you know? And so the most casual person knows dialects better than they think they do. So it's really important to advocate for the audience and make sure that the story is being heard. And Sandy and I are consistently asking ourselves, what is the arc of this scene? What is the tension of this scene? And is the story being told? And the minute the story is not being told, the dialects are scrapped. It's not important if the story isn't being told to use an authentic voice, you know? So the most important thing is the script. So we just lean into that.
Thank you for that as well. This question came through just before that one, Bethany, and you may have answered it, so I apologize. But YouTube question comes in. How many dialects, if you counted, are in The Gift of the Magi?
Yeah, that's a fair question. And I really can't give you a number because, like I said before, it's really down to idiolect, and it's very different types of people. And one relationship that can really illustrate that is the relationship between James and his mother, because James was raised in the upper class of New York, probably the Upper East Side or Upper West Side we talked about. And now his mother considers him living in the tenements of New York, which just means further down Manhattan. So James is really pushing back against the way he was raised, against his mother. And so one fun way that we've really sought to push that dichotomy a little bit further is that James is adopting the speech of the people that he is surrounded by today in the neighborhood that he's in today. And his mother is using a different sound. She is using the transatlantic or mid-Atlantic kind of accent, which is a put-on version of speech that was really exploded in popularity when the talkies came out and died down around World War II. But you'll notice that some famous people like Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn really used that speech, and it's not a real natural form of speech because it was developed to sound posh, to sound upper crust, to sound glamorous and put on. And so you'll really notice a different voice between James and his mother, even though they were raised, that James was raised in her household, that you'll kind of hear a difference in the way that they talk. So we're kind of rounding third on finalizing the voice work, so you'll have to listen in and find out how many dialects are in there for yourself.
Thank
That's
you.
great, Anthony. You started to answer a question that I had of what is the definition of mid-Atlantic accent? When might actors use it and why? And you've identified to be posh, but could you define it? And then after that, Reese, could you tell us why you chose Mid-Atlantic for War of the Worlds?
Yeah, so just to be clear, I was not the dialect coach for War of the Worlds. All of that lovely work was from the actors and from director Reese himself, and so I'm working on Only Gift of Magi, but I can talk a little bit about the transatlantic dialect. It's just a geographical blend between received pronunciation, so that really posh Queen's English British, and the American that was developing in the day. And so it is really popular because of the few actors and actresses that were idealized and mimicked during that time. And so a lot of people call it the strange voices of the 30s and the 40s. You know, all of those movies of the time have the kind of the transatlantic thing going on, where you kind of use your R's differently, and you might use your pitches and your voice variation a little bit differently than today. So that was just a quick little sample. So I'm sure Reese can talk more about why that was utilized for War of the Worlds.
That was nice. That was a nice Katharine Hepburn there.
Well, thank you.
Very nice. Yeah, Katharine Hepburn and Cary Grant are two perfect examples if you want to hear the transatlantic. Not all of the roles in War of the Worlds called for that. Just those characters who had a public persona, like the announcers. And the reason they affected this, from my research, what I found out was that people who were on the air reporting didn't want to be associated with a specific geographical region, because then viewers, listeners assumed that they only knew about that part of the country, as opposed to, you know, being an authority on all things, as reporters like to be. I mean, when you're reporting on something, you want to sound informed, well informed. And if you put it on that accent, then people immediately go, oh, the British, it's a British speaking. Someone's British. He must know so much more than I do. Certainly he knows what's going on. Yeah. So we used it for the announcers, but we did not use it for the locals, nor really the character that Orson Welles played, which is, he was Richard Pearson, who was a scientist who is consulted about these strange explosions on the planet Mars. Nevertheless, Wells, you know, still affected some sort of an accent, but we didn't in our version.
I think John has some additional questions for you all from YouTube.
Sure. Reese, there was a question early on from YouTube asking about the success of War of the Worlds. How many people heard it?
Yeah, I saw that question come in. Well, you know, everybody knows the story. Listeners panicked, thinking that the story was real. Many supposedly jumped in their cars to flee the area of the invasion. It's estimated that about 12 million people were listening when Wells' broadcast came on the air, and about 1 in every 12 thought that it was true. and some percentage of that 1 million people actually fled their homes. When we were in rehearsal for it, one of our actors found this great picture of an old farmer living near Grover's Mill, where they supposedly landed, and he's got this long gun, this double barrel, and he's got sandbags set up outside his house. He's hiding behind these sandbags, ready to go to war with the Martians. I mean, people really bought into it. They thought it was happening.
That picture is in the book Broadcast Hysteria, and so if anybody wants to read that, you'll know how authentic and how not authentic that particular picture is.
Yeah.
How many people actually heard your WGLT broadcast on October 30th, 2020? Do you know?
We haven't really gotten the numbers back from the radio station on that. Preliminarily, we know that there were close to 200 people listening, but as far as they've got a pretty big bandwidth, and so we know for a fact that there were people all over the country tuning in. We just don't know the exact number. I'd love it if it were, thousands.
Yeah. And I know there's a question about the upcoming Gift of the Magi, Friday, December 11th at 8 p.m. on WGLT or WCBU. If you're not exactly local, it's at their other station. If you're not in the listening area, you can go to WGLT's website and click the Listen Live button so you can hear it through a website. But I think one of the questions was, if you can't tune in that night, is there another way to hear it?
I don't know, Reese, if you want to take this, but it will be streamed, I think, for 2 weeks after that.
Right. I had an agreement with PlayScripts, who holds the rights to War of the Worlds. We got permission for one broadcast, and then it's on their site, the radio station's site, can be streamed for a period of 2 weeks before we have to take it down. And that's the same agreement that we have with our playwright for Gift of the Magi, Bob Cooner.
And thank you, Bob, for that. WGLT, understanding that we couldn't congregate and have live audiences right now, created this program, WGLT Presents, for a lot of different kinds of cultural arts organizations to be able to provide entertainment and programming for people. We're so glad that Heartland Theatre is one of the cultural institutions to air some radio plays. Other questions, John Fisher, that are coming from our audience tonight?
I'm aware of only one more right now, Kathleen. Is Heartland going to do more radio plays in the future?
Well, we've got a pretty good thing going here. We don't have any specific scripts, although we are looking at material to present in some format during the month of February for Black History Month. And it's likely that whatever we choose, whether that's a radio play or something that we stream live as we're doing now with actors, it'll probably revolve around Black history.
I see that Bob Cooner has indicated he's got plays to send you. So keep that in mind. I have a question for our listening audience if they want to comment. This would be a final follow-up question. I found it really, really thrilling to listen to War of the Worlds and not know who these actors were. I had read the cast list. I knew people I knew were in it. But when I listened to it, because I couldn't see them, I'm just listening to their voices and I'm swept up into this experience that was so exciting. And I'm wondering, did other people have the same experience? And I'm guessing that the people that grew up listening listening to the radio, that was the main source of entertainment, probably had experienced that the whole time growing up, the thrill of your imagination working as you listen to a play unfold. But I see that it's 8:00. And so I want to thank you all for being here with us on YouTube. Thank you to all of our theater artists tonight. It was wonderful to hear about to get an inside look on your experience producing these 2 radio plays. And I so look forward to listening to The Gift of the Magi, Friday, December 11th, 8 p.m. Central Standard Time on WGLT, or the other ways that you can listen to it. Thank you so much, John Fisher of the Normal Public Library, for managing everything for us. And this will still be on YouTube. For if anybody joined us in progress, you can go back and see it and listen to it, and add comments and questions at any time. We'll keep an eye on that as well. So thank you all for being with us. Good night.